If you usually expect the law to act like, a precision instrument, a mechanism where a rule is broken, evidence is presented, and a judgment is delivered with absolute mathematical certainty, you might want to recalibrate a bit for today's deep dive.
Yeah, you really do, because we're so used to legal frameworks functioning like classical physics, right? It's all predictable, linear, cause and effect stuff. A leads directly to B.
Right, exactly. But when you subject things like digital speech or highly entangled social networks, and especially the whole messy concept of human intent to that classical framework, the machinery just completely breaks down.
It does. It creates this really fascinating diagnostic crisis. I mean, you are basically watching a pre-modern, inherently linear institution try to force its rigid geometry onto a non-linear, unpredictable reality.
It's like trying to measure the shape of a cloud using a pair of rigid calipers. And that friction, that exact mismatch, is what we're unpacking today. We've got a massive, highly unusual stack of source material for this one.
We really do. It's an incredible collection of analyses.
Yeah, so what we have is a suite of major AI models. We're talking ChatGPT, Copilot, DeepSeek, Gemini, Grok, and Quinn. And they were all fed the exact same legal documents from a single, highly unusual case.
And they independently analyze the arguments, and today we're unpacking their consensus.
Right. But before we jump into the actual mechanics of this, a quick note to you, the listener. These sources contain politically charged content from a specific legal system.
Yeah, that's important to keep in mind.
Our goal here is never to take sides or endorse any viewpoints, but simply to impartially report on the ideas and the arguments contained in this original source material. We're just looking at the architecture of the arguments impartially.
And the architecture of this specific defense is exactly what makes it such a perfect focal point for complex systems analysis. We're looking at the case of Dr. Chen Jingyuan.
Right.
He's a physics PhD and an independent scholar who focuses on complex systems. And the basic facts of the case are pretty straightforward, actually.
Okay, set the scene for us.
So between 2019 and 2022, he used a VPN to access Twitter from his home. And over those 3 years, he retweeted various content.
Just retweeted, not original posts.
Mostly just retweets, yeah. And the content ranged from, political satire and philosophical observations all the way to official public statements from the U.S. Embassy.
Okay. And then what happened?
Well, he was arrested. He was charged with a crime formerly translated as, quote, picking quarrels and provoking trouble.
Picking quarrels and provoking trouble. That's quite a title.
Yeah, and legally, that charge carries the burden of proving two things. First, that he spread false information, and second, that he caused severe public disorder. Ultimately, he was sentenced to 20 months in prison.
Which, on paper, that reads like a standard modern narrative of digital information control. Someone
Sure.
posts something, the state doesn't like it, they get locked up.
Right, it seems like a familiar story.
But the incredible twist here, and the reason all these different AI models isolated this specific case, is how Dr. Chen actually mounted his defense.
Yeah, his defense is just wild.
He didn't do standard legal wrangling. Like, he wrote this blood letter from prison and filed appeals where he completely bypassed the usual arguments over statutory definitions.
He essentially escalated his defense into theoretical physics and pure mathematics.
Exactly. He used Gödel's incompleteness theorems, Bayesian probability, and complex sisters theory to just totally dismantle the foundational logic of the charges.
He basically put the entire judicial framework under a mathematician's microscope, which is brilliant.
It really is. So let's start with section 1 of our deep dive here. Let's look at the high education paradox. Because to understand how he dismantled the case, we have to look at the prosecution's baseline argument, right?
Right. The court needed to prove subjective malice, basically, that he intentionally and knowingly spread falsehoods.
And to do that, they actually used his own academic background as a weapon against him.
They did. The court's deductive reasoning was, well, Dr. Chen is a fully capable person with high education.
Because he holds a PhD.
Exactly. So because he has a PhD, the court concluded he, quote, must have known the information he was retweeting was false and insulting to the political system.
Okay, let's unpack this for a second. The court is saying PhD equals knowing absolute truth.
That was their literal legal argument, yeah.
But isn't the whole point of a PhD to realize how much you actually don't know? I mean, advanced scientific training is all about stripping away the illusion of absolute certainty.
Precisely. It trains the mind to view data points as provisional probabilities, not religious truths.
Right. It's like giving someone a speeding ticket just because they own a sports car. Completely regardless of how fast they were actually driving at the time.
That is a perfect analogy, and the AI sources actually deconstruct this specific leap in logic using something called Bayesian jurisprudence.
Bayesian jurisprudence. Okay, break that down for us.
So in a mathematically sound legal process, a trial is basically an exercise in updating probabilities. You start with a prior probability, which is your baseline presumption of innocence.
Innocent until proven guilty.
Exactly. Then, as you introduce evidence, you apply a likelihood ratio.
Okay, and what does that ratio measure?
It asks a specific question. How much more likely is it that we would see this specific piece of evidence if the defendant is guilty compared to if they are innocent?
Oh, I see. So if the evidence is like a smoking gun found in the defendant's hand, that likelihood ratio is extremely high.
Right, and the probability of guilt spikes. But if the evidence is just the fact that the defendant lived in the same city as the crime, the ratio is near 1, so the probability barely moves at all.
But the sources identified a massive base rate fallacy in how the court applied this to Dr. Chen.
A huge one. By using his, quote, high education as a mechanism to just assume intent, the court catastrophically distorted that prior probability.
They basically approached the whole case with the mathematical assumption that a highly educated person just naturally possesses this extraordinarily high baseline probability of wanting to execute a malicious plot.
Exactly. They substituted a societal prejudice for a statistical baseline.
Which is crazy when you think about the actual evidence. I mean, the evidence is the act of clicking a retweet button. The base rate of innocence for retweeting something approaches infinity.
Oh, absolutely. Millions of nodes on a digital network retweet content every single day.
Right. People retweet to bookmark a link or to track an opposing viewpoint or just to say, hey, look at this, without harboring any subjective malice or endorsing the tweet as absolute truth.
And that's why the AI models classify the court's methodology here as reverse Bayesianism.
Reverse Bayesianism, so working backwards.
Exactly. A functional system allows objective evidence to update the probability. But a malfunctioning closed system like this court starts with an immovable posterior conclusion.
The conclusion that Chen is guilty.
Right. And then it retroactively forces the prior assumptions and the evidence to fit that predetermined narrative. They took his capacity for complex critical thought, mathematically inverted it, and treated it as empirical proof of a crime.
Wow. So because the court demanded this standard of absolute certainty insisting he must have known, the retweets were definitively false. Chen had to escalate.
He really had no choice. He had to destroy the legal definition of truth itself.
Which brings us to the second major theme the AI is analyzed. Chen drags the court into pure epistemology. He says, okay, if you're claiming I knowingly spread a falsehood, I demand the mathematical proof of what constitutes absolute truth in political science.
And to do that, he introduces Kurt Gödel's Incompleteness theorems into a criminal court proceeding.
Which is just, I mean, that's such a flex.
It's an incredible legal maneuver. But to understand it, we need to look at the mechanical weight of what Gödel actually proved back in 1931.
Right, so Gödel's first and second incompleteness theorems, he basically demonstrated that any formal logical system that's complex enough to do basic arithmetic cannot be both complete and consistent.
That's the core of it, yes. Within any sufficiently complex framework, there are always going to be mathematically true statements that are fundamentally unprovable using the rules of that system.
So Gödel shattered the dream that human reason could build a perfect closed loop of absolute truth. There are hard structural limits to certainty. The system can never fully validate itself from the inside.
And Chen takes that mathematical reality and maps it directly onto his legal defense.
How does he frame it to the judge?
He argues that because all human knowledge systems are inherently incomplete and flawed, his default operational state is cognitive humility and academic skepticism.
So he's saying I couldn't knowingly spread a false rumor, because absolute truth and absolute falsehood, especially regarding abstract political views, are mathematically undecidable.
Exactly. He's telling the court, I was operating as a researcher, aggregating unprovable data points, not some saboteur dealing in absolute lies.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting, but also a bit tricky. Let me push back on this.
Sure.
Because as conceptually bulletproof as that math is, if we follow Chen's logic to its absolute limit, doesn't it threaten the foundation of any legal system?
How do you mean?
Well, if truth is mathematically unknowable, couldn't anyone commit any crime like fraud or perjury and just say, well, Your Honor, reality is too complex for you to prove I lied? Doesn't the law have to draw a pragmatic line in the sand?
That is a completely valid question, and the AI sources actually address that exact tension.
Oh, they do.
Yeah. The law does operate on a pragmatic compromise. It doesn't actually demand objective, universal certainty about the cosmos. It demands subjective certainty.
Objective certainty. So what's going on in the defendant's head?
Right. To get a guilty verdict for this specific charge, the prosecution has to prove a deliberate internal mental state. They have to prove that Chen subjectively categorized the info as false in his own mind and then specifically intended to deceive others.
Ah, okay. So the burden is on proving his internal categorization process, not the objective reality of the tweets themselves.
Exactly. And this is where Chen's philosophical stance legitimately mathematically negates the legal requirement for subjective intent.
Because his whole mindset refuses to make that binary choice.
Right. He has a documented lifelong academic methodology of treating all info with skepticism. So it's highly probable he never subjectively labeled those posts as absolute lies. The legal standard requires a binary true or false categorization that his scientific mindset structurally refuses to make.
The AI models frame this as a profound epistemological collision, don't they?
A total civilizational clash.
Yeah, because we have this modern scientific epistemology, one that accepts uncertainty and incompleteness and probability colliding at high speed, with a pre-modern judicial system that demands binary labels, 1 or 0, guilty or innocent.
The system is basically trying to force a quantum state into a classical Newtonian box.
It's a complete mismatch. But okay, even if the philosophical defense invalidates his internal intent, the court still had a physical trapdoor, right? The second part of the charge.
Right. The prosecution pivoted. They basically said, okay, forget the philosophy of his mind. Let's look at the physics of his network.
Because the law also said he caused severe public disorder.
Exactly. So this shifts the AI analysis away from Bayesian updating and Gödel and moves it straight into complex network theory.
Let's look at the actual empirical data from the legal docs on this. Dr. Chen's Twitter account had fewer than 100 followers.
Less than 100.
And the AI models point out that, given he was on a VPN, a large chunk of those were likely inactive, or bot accounts anyway. Plus, his total retweet count over 20 years was under 100.
And crucially, there was zero empirical evidence of any societal reaction.
No protests, no secondary transmission cascades, nothing. The original post he amplified just stayed online, totally untouched by moderators.
So measuring the actual physical impact of his actions yields a statistical 0. He generated no measurable friction in the real world.
Well, wait, let me play devil's advocate again here using chaos theory.
Let's hear it.
We all know the butterfly effect, right? A butterfly flaps its wings in Brazil, causes a tornado in Texas. Social media is a highly nonlinear, complex system. Couldn't one retweet from a tiny account theoretically hit the right algorithm and cause a massive societal meltdown?
The AIs love that exact point. And they use complex network theory to completely debunk it in this context.
Okay, how?
Because social media platforms do not operate like a uniform grid of dry brush waiting for a spark. They are what's called scale-free networks.
Scale-free networks, meaning what exactly?
Meaning the distribution of connections follows a power law.
Oh, so a small handful of massive hub nodes like major news orgs or celebrities hold almost all the connections.
Right. They dictate the flow of info. While the overwhelming majority of users, like Chen, are edge nodes with microscopic connectivity.
So for an edge node's butterfly flap to cause an avalanche, what has to happen?
The entire system must already be in a highly unstable critical state, and the prosecution never provided any proof that society was hovering at that critical threshold.
And didn't the models also analyze this using epidemiological math?
Yeah, they used R0, the basic reproduction number.
Right, R0. We hear about that with viruses. If one person infects more than one other person, the R0 is greater than 1, and the virus spreads exponentially.
But if it's less than 1, the transmission chain mathematically decays and dies out.
So applying that to Chen's retweets.
His follower count mathematically guaranteed an R0 far below 1. When he retweeted something, it hit a dead end almost instantly.
Any cascade would just extinguish itself.
Exactly. The probability of his node causing severe public disorder is effectively 0. The AI concludes that accusing an isolated edge node of causing severe chaos isn't just an exaggeration, it's a structural impossibility.
It violates the actual physics of the network. So let's zoom out and synthesize this. We have a legal apparatus using broken probability to assume malice. It ignores the mathematical limits of truth. And it disregards how digital networks actually function.
Right.
When the AI models scale up from Chen's specific defense, What do they conclude about the legal system itself?
The consensus shifts into systems philosophy. They see this case not just as a legal error, but as a civilizational fault line.
A civilizational fault line, that's heavy.
It is, because you are watching a linear, mechanical tool, criminal law, fail completely as it tries to govern a nonlinear, high-entropy digital ecosystem.
And the AIs talk about feedback loops here, right?
Yes. In systems theory, a resilient system needs negative feedback loops to survive. Those are self-correcting mechanisms.
So if a system makes an error, the negative feedback loop applies friction and corrects it.
Exactly. But the judicial process in this case actively eliminated all negative feedback. They held secret trials, refused appeals, and literally blocked his complaint letters from leaving the prison.
So they severed their own sensory organs, they isolated themselves from external data.
And when you remove negative feedback, you lock the system into a positive feedback loop of error. The system just amplifies its own mistakes because no one is allowed to correct the bad data.
The system blamed its own macro-level anxiety, its fear of the unpredictable internet, on a single, powerless micronode.
They targeted Chen to release that systemic pressure.
So what does this all mean for us? The system is treating the natural statistical noise of a complex society as a catastrophic criminal threat, which, ironically, destroys its own shock absorbers. By forcing this rigid order, they actually make the whole society more fragile.
That's the ultimate takeaway. The rigid pursuit of total systemic security ensures long-term systemic fragility.
Wow. We started with this obscure legal proceeding about a few dozen retweets, but by looking at it through Bayesian math, Gödel's incompleteness, and chaos theory, we've really mapped a profound mismatch between human laws and complex reality.
It really is like trying to use calipers to measure a cloud. But, the synthesis of these models leaves us with a lingering, pretty provocative concept that builds on all of this.
Oh, what direction do the AI models point to next?
Well, if human legal systems are too linear and too vulnerable to cognitive bias and predefined narratives to accurately judge actions in these complex digital networks, it raises a huge question. Will we eventually need to build Bayesian courts?
Wait, really? Bayesian courts, like run by algorithms?
Exactly. Courts run by computational frameworks that calculate actual mathematical probabilities of harm, rather than relying on human judges who fall prey to the base rate fallacy.
Algorithms that dynamically map network topology and calculate the R0 of a tweet before assigning liability. That is an incredibly chilling concept regarding human autonomy.
It is. But given the structural failures of the human legal apparatus we've unpacked today, it might be a reality we're accelerating toward. It's definitely something to ponder the next time you hit retweet.
The idea of a purely mathematical justice system calculating your intent, yeah, that is a thought that's going to stick with me. Thank you to you, the listener, for joining us as we navigated the deep end of this source material. Keep asking questions, keep looking at the world through multiple lenses, and remember, sometimes when the diagnostic reading comes back as chaotic, it's not the subject that's broken, it's the machine doing the reading.